with the better. Anyway, we go back now to see how this primal impulse was established and fixed and formalized in our time. Multiculturalism is really an anthropological concept. Right? It goes back to the great impetus given to this idea by one of the major anthropologists of the modern era. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work. His name is Franz Boas. And he wrote many, and he did marvelous work. He's a great man. I admire him. But the source of what we call the multicultural disease is to be found in his work, especially in a book called The Mind of Primitive Man, in which he wrote, and I'm going to quote now, that all cultures should be regarded with sympathy, that we should hold the conviction that all races, that's his word, today he wouldn't have used that word, he would have used the term ethnicities, that all races have contributed to cultural progress in one way or another, and that they are equally capable of advancing the interests of mankind. In other words, no culture is superior to any other culture. All cultures have to be regarded with the same degree of sympathy. All cultures are equal in terms of the fact that each one wishes in its own way to advance the interests of mankind. You see where it starts? His colleague, another great anthropologist who doesn't have the same réclame that he has, but is also, I was going to bring one of his books here tonight, but anyway, I forgot, is Boryslaw Malinowski, perhaps you've heard of him? Boryslaw Malinowski?
Yes.
Malinowski?
Yes.
Political scientist?
Well, his work moved in that direction, but he was an anthropologist, and he was famous for studying the Trobriand Islanders of Melanesia. He wrote many essays about them, and he propounded there a theory, and I'm quoting again, of the types of social behavior which must be analyzed for the need each of them fills in maintaining society. The idea behind there is, you see, in a way it even leads to Levi-Strauss' structural anthropology. The idea is that what works for a culture works for that culture. It cannot be condemned. It cannot be criticized. It cannot be reduced in its significance to something less than what we experience in our own culture. Whatever devices or principles, whatever intellectual and mental apparatus, whatever clan divisions have been decided upon, if they work for that culture, they work. And in fact, they were developed because they worked for that culture, and then they were, in a way, fixed at epoxy because they worked for that culture. So it would be wrong, for example, to criticize the Trobriand Islanders because they killed people for sport. Because they, let's say, killed people for sport. Or cannibalized people. It worked. That's what made that culture function. You see? These are the ideas of Franz Boas and Bronislaw Malinowski. It is essentially the concept of cultural relativity, which through their students, whom you might be familiar with, for example, Ruth Benedict in Patterns of Culture, or Margaret Mead in Coming of Age in Samoa, which we all read in university, where we found that the Samoans were uninhibited, that they didn't need to be analyzed by Freudian structures, that they enjoyed free sex, premarital sex, postmarital sex, extramarital sex, every kind of surplus sex that you could possibly imagine without the slightest element or iota of guilt, of reflection, of shame, of anything like that. They were free, they were open, they were spontaneous. In other words, they were the South Pacific version of Haight-Ashbury. They were the hippies of Melanesia. And that's why Margaret Mead became, the adopted anthropologist of my generation. But she was a student, along with Ruth Benedict, with whom she had a long-standing affair, by the way, because, gay sex, lesbian sex, which I have nothing against personally, but I mean that was almost like a principle. If you really wanted, your PhD, you had to be gay or lesbian. I mean, even when I was at Berkeley, in the middle of this revolution, my teacher in drama, I was studying drama. As if I needed to study drama in Berkeley. Anyway, my teacher was a wonderful guy. He introduced me to the works of Gelderode, the great Belgian playwright that I'd never heard of before. Samuel Draper was his name. I really liked him. And I was his favorite student and got the highest grades without having to work. He desired me. He would come and have supper with my wife at the time. And we lived about half an hour away from the campus. He would come for supper and he would say straight out to Tanya, my wife, he would say, I want David. Will you let him come with me tonight? And of course, I was so young, I had no idea what he was talking about. And what did he look before? Really, yeah. But I mean, that was the whole idea. That's why I got A++ in his courses. Because he desired me, and that was fine. That was fine, because you see, scholarship had already started to go out the window. You didn't have to study. You didn't have to learn. You just had to stand up, have a microphone, if you possibly could, or a bullhorn, and be desired, or desire. This was the anti-Oedipus of our French colleagues. It all started there. But this was the idea of cultural relativity. None of the norms that we had accepted applied any longer. We had rejected the morality of laminated discretion, which we associated with our parents. Right? And we found it hypocritical and we found it confining. This was what I called earlier, and it's been called like that, the New World Order. But it started in our time with Franz Boas. And through Boas, Malinowski, Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, and by the way, there's an interesting book out by another anthropologist called Eric Freeman, which you could find. I don't think you could buy it in a bookstore now. You have to go to 8 books. I think it's been remaindered. But it's interesting. It's called Margaret Mead in Samoa. And Derek Freeman, who's a reputable anthropologist, demolished Margaret Mead entirely and pointed out, he did his research, that she had been lied to by other correspondents in Samoa. They were an uptight, pre-Victorian culture that would actually terrify sexuality, and it would ostracize people if they violated the very strict, ossified norms that pertained in that society. But they had a good time with Margaret Mead. They lied. They lied constantly. So she produced a book which violated entirely not only the principles of her discipline, but the actual structure of the society, of the culture that she was presumably observing and living in. Big joke. But that was, we know that now, though most of the anthropologists don't really want to accept that yet. So it starts there, and what all these anthropologists had in common was a corrosive suspicion, and now you see where we're heading, a corrosive suspicion of the universality of Western norms and cultural principles, right? Which has gradually, but decisively penetrated into the zeitgeist of the Western world, culminating in what we now call postmodernism. And what is postmodernism? Well, nobody really knows for sure. It's one of those buzzwords that everybody likes to use, but it does have certain features which can identify it and distinguish it from, let's say, what we call modernism, which was much more tight. Postmodernism says there is no such thing as a master narrative. There are only little narratives that prevail in each particular culture, and each narrative is as valid as any other narrative. We have a narrative that tells us that, we divide our history into ages. There was the classical age, and there was the dark age, which was really dark, right? The sun didn't rise for 400 years. And then there was the Enlightenment, and suddenly, just like that, the sun popped up, and suddenly the whole world was illuminated in the radiance of wisdom. And so that was the age of the Enlightenment. And then there was the age of reason, and so on and so on, right? This is a narrative. We feel, Boaz would have said to us, that this narrative is universal, that it applies to all cultures. But it doesn't, according to postmodernism. It applies only to ours. And even that narrative may be too grand a narrative. It may be an invention. You see, as Foucault would say, it's an episteme. It's an expression of the ruling class that wants us to believe that there is such a thing as political progress when there is only political regression. That's what Foucault would have said. But you see, that's a postmodern idea. Another postmodern idea, what we designate as truth does not exist. There is only interpretation. There is only a local hermeneutic. Nietzsche first articulated that. There is no such thing as truth, there is only interpretation, said Nietzsche. And this was picked up by Foucault and the postmodernists and the post-structuralists and so on. The interesting thing is, and I've written about that, it's so obvious. If Nietzsche or Foucault says there is no such thing as truth, only interpretation, are we to take that as a truth or as an interpretation? It's clear. Because when Nietzsche articulated that principle, that maxim, he meant it as a truth. And when Foucault said that all that we call truth is only the expression of a power episteme, whoever happens to control the press and the economy, the politics of the time, they are the ones who determine what we consider to be the truth, then what would happen to Foucault's idea? Because he obviously set himself against the dominant ethos of the time. So whose truth was he articulating if all truth is only an expression of a power group? I mean, you see, this is the contradiction that is inherent in what we call postmodernism, and yet I still read articles by people who say this. And yet, these are mainly university professors. These are mainly academics who say this. Then they go home, and the kid does something, and they say, "Don't lie to me." And also, what we call the idea of postmodernism would tell us that what we call freedom, that is to say, freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, gender equality, equality for the law, I was talking about before, traditional matrimony, all these are only culture-specific assumptions, and they do not, therefore, apply to all cultures. And from this follows directly the scourge of multiculturalism.